Welcome to Parallax. Parallax, the construction amidst eternal decay. Parallax, the portal to the edge of chaos. Parallax, poem and provocation.
The occasion for this podcast is Luke's course, which is coming up, which has a very provocative title, Why the World Hates Christianity. I'm not a Christian. I guess it doesn't matter, but I'm not sure if Daniel's a Christian. I asked Jordan because he was the first person I thought of for a few reasons. I think Jordan has just recently publicly converted, and he also has a lot to say, I think, about society in general, and is one of the more pertinent commentators on what's going on, kind of. So, and then Luke, of course, has done several courses with Parallax. He's my close friend, and we do Gurdjieff discussion groups together at Parallax, and he's written a book, exploring Gurdjieff and Christianity. So anyway, welcome, gentlemen, and perhaps I'll just begin, I guess, with Luke with the course and the question and the query, which is why is there this hatred, let's say, or strong, powerful kind of reaction to Christianity? Go ahead, Luke.
Yes, thank you, Andrew, and nice to see you, gentlemen. Why do a course on why the world hates Christianity? Well, in a sense, the question was trying to move past the politics and culture wars and all the institutional stuff that's happened over the years with the various churches and other bits and pieces. Really trying to get out of the weeds and to see something a little bit more clearly, something at the level of energies and forces, what was unleashed 2,000 years ago. And so there's this real question for me that there has been the visceral kind of hatred or the reaction against it, because the message of the Christian faith very much rubs up against the human ego. It really goes right to the heart of it. And so for me, just to think about that, maybe there is just a small chance that what's said in the Gospels and all the events that transpired around it long ago, if there is just a small chance that any of that is true, then we all should be crapping our pants. There is something quite profound that has happened, quite profound that was unleashed to the world, and trying to understand that at an energetic level, an ecology of energy, an energy economy, what really took place there. So the course tries to explore this at that kind of level. It tries to just unpack, just to try to sweep away a little bit all of the surface stuff, and really goes, what is the heart here? What reaction does it cause in you? What reaction has it caused in the world, and maybe why? So that's the reason for the course, and hopefully over 3 weeks we will unpack that a little further and hopefully confront some of those things which are not always brought to the surface in conversation.
So I was thinking of Ivan Illich, who said Christianity is the best and the worst. And there's something like that is, as a non-Christian, I perceive it to be at its best, something absolutely profound and wonderful. And a lot of what I've seen has been pretty terrible. So that's my experience with Christianity.
I like the way that Luke is ultimately framing it. Well, the first thing that I thought about was most of the conversations that happen around Christianity are operating at the wrong level. And therefore, in fact, actually really conversations about Christianity. They're more sword fights without any real engagement. And so, for example, let's just kind of break the question, because you notice the question actually has a built-in unfolding. So we can kind of ask at least two versions of the same question. One would be, why does the world hate Christ? And here you can actually split that into two more as well, because you can have capital T, capital W, i.e. the prince of the world. Why does the world hate Christ? And then why does the world of people hate Christ? And then why does the world hate Christianity? And why does the world hate Christianity? Because they're complex. And oddly enough, I was actually, who was I watching? Oh, David Bentley Hart on Christology just today. And so you actually have also the paradox of Christ in the middle of that box of four. So if you look at our little picture right here, a little dot in the center, all God, all man, and no confusion and no mixture. So you can kind of go down each one of those. So just as kind of an example, if you take the category of why does the world, in other words, the powers and principalities, the prince of this world, hate Christ? Well, in some sense, that answer is actually very easy, because Christ has defeated the world. Christ has upended the world, overturned the world, and rendered the principalities under his dominion, and ultimately replacing their positions of dominion and authority with human beings, saints, which must be particularly galling. And so that form, what's happening there, is the kind of the seething hatred of that which is intrinsically dominated by resentment, now forced into a backwards movement and clawing desperately to maintain and rebuke as much as possible. From hell's heart I stab at thee sensibility. And that's important, because at the level of energies, that's kind of at the very, very bottom of the stack, this war between Christ triumphant and the playing out of that triumph in reality with the powers and principalities still very much in a position to make a mess of things in every possible way. So, I mean, I could unfold the other three, but that at least feels like when I listen to the framing, it's like, okay, that's actually a really good framing, because it allows us to step into the more superficial, at the end of the day, questions with a context around them.
Daniel, why don't you jump in here?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to see everyone today, and I appreciate both what Luke and Jordan are bringing. I think that's absolutely right, Jordan. I think it's Ephesians where there's this notion of the God of this age or the Lord of the air. 2 Corinthians, there's this very interesting notion throughout the Bible that there are actually sort of these evil forces, enemy forces that are actually at work, that there's some sort of principalities, zygites, modes of thinking of which have to be resisted and worked against, right? And so, obviously when we have this idea of why does the world hate Christianity, by the world, you can't mean every possible individual, because people can be converted, right? People can be brought into the fold, right? Now, there is a suggestion that there is perhaps some sort of latent knee-jerk reaction against what Christ is teaching, where when you first hear it, you're like, "Arr!" So that's there. But there's also this idea that the hatred it doesn't have the final say necessarily, right? That it doesn't have there may be this sort of latent rejection, but it doesn't have a deterministic necessarily you're closed off and that's it in terms of individuals. However, in terms of this principality that is the world, it has some sort of mode of understanding, some sort of mode of approach, which seems more necessarily against whatever Christ is bringing to the picture. That it actually is a mode of understanding or a mode of carrying oneself in the world of which, when it encounters Christ, hates it. And I like what was being said on this idea that, the world is defeated, the world is overturned. So that's a pretty good reason to dislike it, right? Now, what's also very interesting to me, because when I hear the question, why does the world here hate Christianity? there's a few things where you can say, well, there are millions of Christians, right? I mean, it doesn't seem like Christianity is always hated. I grew up in an area where being a non-Christian would get you more hate, right? Everyone seems, if you're not going to church, there could be problems, right? So there's this kind of interesting idea of what exactly do we talk about when we talk about Christianity? What exactly is that? And what exactly is being rejected? Also, I think there's the temptation that you see in some Christians, because you were mentioning Ivan Illich on the inversion principle that he's playing on, is that a Christian has to be very careful to be too eager to be rejected, as in they're looking to be rejected, because then actually instead of being like Christ, they just might act in a way that the people around them dislike. And then when people dislike them, they say, yes, I've achieved Christ likeness because I'm rejected, right? That's very problematic, where you're actually looking for rejection. And therefore, when you get rejection, you go, I've done the work of Jesus, right? And I actually think that is a temptation that Christians can fall into, where perhaps Christ poses this very high standard of how we are supposed to act. We're supposed to love our enemies, my gosh. And then, of course, when he says love your neighbor, the examples he gives of neighbors are people that the Jews don't like. Oh, man, the Samaritans? Come on now. So there's all these sort of tensions. And instead of doing all that, you could also just be how you naturally are around people, maybe short-tempered, maybe not exactly listening to other people. And then when people don't want to hang out with you, you say, well, that's what you get for being like Christ in the world, right? So there has to be a resistance of that. But then at the same time, there is something that Christ is putting forth that suggests if you indeed don't fall for temptations of what Bonhoeffer called cheap grace, and instead do the work of costly grace. If you indeed seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, there is some point, some place that one arrives at that will necessarily be rejected. It's almost a kind of earned rejection versus a poured in from the top rejection. It's a rejection that has to be tarried to, not just one day wake up and decide I've got it. And at that point, that's where I ask the question of what does it mean that the world hates Christianity? At that point, what is it the world is rejecting? This makes me think of things like that which and then I'll pass it on before I keep talking, on the world hates that which it doesn't readily understand, that which it can readily make intelligible, that which it can't easily quantify, that which it can't stick into a simple program or stick it into an economic system. One could think of Nick Land on AI singularity and all of that. Like, the world does not tend to like that of which it doesn't readily understand, and also that of which it witnesses a person living, then makes it reflect on itself and ask, could I live that way as well? Why aren't I living that way? We don't like having those kind of existential reflections on ourselves. So that necessary point at the other end of a certain earned rejection is where my mind goes. But I'll pause.
So before I pass it to Luke, what came to my mind is, again, since me and Luke studied Gurdjieff, this idea of conscious suffering, intentional suffering, which Christ seems to exemplify. And that's another thing that people don't want or won't readily go towards, being able to face that kind of suffering. So that was just perhaps the image of Christ, the offense of Christ is suffering, right? In a way, right? We don't want that. So passing it over to Luke, perhaps.
Yeah, no, that idea of suffering, not wanting to invite it, but when it comes, trying to face it. Certainly in the Gurdjieff work, if one runs too eagerly to suffering, it just goes all to the wrong place. It goes to the ego. It's a competition, right? And that just reinforces something which is really anti-Christ. So you sort of make everything worse for yourself. But the delicate art of if suffering does come your way, not to run away from it, but to try to deal with it, is very, very difficult. But there is this sense that whatever happened 2,000 years ago, this outpouring of the Holy Spirit, this energy that entered our species is constantly pressing up against us. It's constantly causing this friction. It's like something's being incubated. And so whether you're Christian or non-Christian, you're going to feel it in some way, shape or form. And either one finds a way, whether one uses the word Christ, Holy Spirit or whatever, this energy, this force, either one attempts to turn towards it and tries to deal with it in some way, or one rejects it, one's not able to integrate it. Maybe for a time, maybe there's an opportunity at some point in one's life to accept it. Maybe it's at the point of death, who knows? But there is this sense that something changed in history. Of course, we're all used to it now, so it's been a long time, but something remarkable changed. Something was infused that none of us can escape from. And so how do we deal with it? And it must catalyze in some way. It must reach a critical mass. It must affect everything and everyone. So what does that mean? The parousia. Maybe there is something that needs to reach a boiling point, and we all feel that in some way, shape or form. Anyway, there's just that sense there at the fundamental level. It's not just the level of ideas or a message or something to grapple with, but there's something coming up against us in the being that everybody has.
Let me throw three more logs in the fire. One is the problem that the church by necessity must always fail. This obviously is going to create a continuous experience of, at the very least, annoyance. But it's critical to recognize the church of necessity must always fail. That's very problematic. And that connects down to the micro level, which is that, and every individual will also by necessity fail. And this is not the kind of thing where you're going to figure it out or you're going to win on your own. Right? That's kind of one of the key elements. Even to and you get these very sticky things. So if like we talk about this idea of like voluntary suffering, and then the artificial assumption of, you kind of put on the Christ Halloween costume and go walk around with your styrofoam cross, and you're like, yes, I'm suffering voluntarily. And like, nope, even in fact, and particularly not that. And so you as an individual will always fail. The people around you who are endeavoring to be in discipleship will always fail. And the church in general will always fail. And it will fail sometimes in a fashion which is relatively lightweight. Sometimes it'll fail in a fashion which is somewhat catastrophic. And so, of course, this is a very difficult thing because we look at the world. Isn't that funny? Like we look at the world as a way of getting an evidence of what's happening. So when we want to see Christ, we can't help but look at the church and think that we're seeing Christ. And since the church by necessity must always fail, we then get this powerful tension, which is part of the boiling point. And then the third piece, and this just landed on me when Luke mentioned that it happened 2,000 years ago, which is, we live in Babylon right now. We currently live in Babylon. In spite of the fact that this thing entered the world 2,000 years ago and didn't do nothing, it actually did a tremendous amount. Nonetheless, Babylon continues to burble forth, and our participation continues to go through this process of denaturing. I mean, we find a way to produce an idol by hook or by crook until eventually we've migrated once again to being idol worshipers. You can pick your poison what the current flavor of that looks like. And then, of course, the pressure of metanoia is just pressing on us tremendously. You can imagine maybe 50 years ago how agonizing that would have been to say, hey, aren't we actually in a triumphant Christian civilization that has at long last defeated the forces of darkness and is delivering on the promises of Christ in the world in every direction? And yet, no, you're actually living in Babylon. And therefore the presence of heaven is even more intense upon you.
No, that's very, very well put. Well, if a few things come to mind. First off, on that idea of suffering, if I told you, hey, suffering is good for you, you would naturally say that's really dumb. Unless perhaps you're born after Jesus, and you have this kind of idea that actually there is something to the suffering servant that actually taps you into a way of being that otherwise was not afforded, or maybe you were an athlete, and so lifting weights and so on was good. But you see, what's very interesting, like Michelle and I talk about this all the time, if you don't have the possibility that suffering has some sort of gain, versus the social scripts of going to the gyms and all, doing all these things, which are in the script of suffering, right? That's kind of different. But the suffering that seems arbitrary, like, for example, every time you feel uncomfortable, take a pill. You could, every time it's too cold, turn on the heat. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you do that, right? Unless for some reason you have an idea that suffering should not always be resisted or technologically removed or something like that, right? But everyone around you might just think you're stubborn or dumb or so on and so forth. And one of the things that's just very important is, I think, if there's no possibility of there being some, I don't want to say irrational, but non-rational, which is an important category for me, non-rational gain, a gain that cannot be put into a rational calculus before it is experienced. If there's no possibility of a non-rational gain from suffering, then you're basically stuck, like the little mouse in that Kafka story that's in a hole and it can't turn around, in the technological essence, as Heidegger would say, or the utility, just get rid of suffering, just get rid of suffering, and then you find yourself like that little mouse somewhere you don't want to go. And I do think basically we're in the age of Kafka more than Orwell and Huxley, although of course there's truth to all of these because all of Kafka's novels are about protagonists, well, except the investigation of a dog. They're stuck where their very mode of consciousness is what leads them to imprisonment. They just, by their very logic of how they're supposed to react, go deeper and deeper and deeper into something that they can't get out of. And there's something in Jesus that unveiling, actually, there's something to suffering. There's something to being not understood. There's something to being actually perhaps even rejected by the religious leaders of your day that actually open up new possibilities that if you were just doing what was, say, logical or rational or practical, you would never escape. Oh, and then worse yet, you wouldn't know you were entrapped either, because if you're entrapped, you don't know you're entrapped. It's like Kierkegaard said that the man who's in despair doesn't know they're in despair, because once you know you're in despair, you can start to move out of it, right? Like if you don't know something, you also don't know something. And so there's this entrapment logic that's always in operation that one has to perpetually guard against. But then how do you even know you need to guard against it, right? And so, when I hear Jordan mentioning Babylon, there's this idea in this moment of it, there's this sort of moment in history that reveals all these alternative non-rational possibilities, if you grant me that, and then I'll close with this, that are so against how we naturally experience suffering. Get rid of it is the natural thing. It's so naturally against the idea of what we should seek. Jesus puts a question mark beside all success. You say being successful is great. Maybe, maybe not. It's not that Jesus says no. That would almost make it easy. If he said success is necessarily bad, then great, just avoid success. No, he does the same way, he just puts a little question mark by it, right? The brain naturally doesn't hold well to question marks. So it is very easy to go back into habits or modes of structuring that lead us right back into Babylon. And there has to be this perpetual effort of remembering it. And then a church, I love that point that the church necessarily has to fail. How in the world do you create an institution that has part of its very internal logic, the necessity of realizing that institutions can squash the spirit or lead to quantification that is bad? That contradiction right there seems to have a self-devouring logic. But one of the revelations of Christ is that actually that contradiction, if you will, is actually necessary for keeping the spirit alive. But it is very hard to hold to that, especially in an age where in an age that wants quantifiable results for everything or an explanation for everything, and you can't easily get it. But Jesus says, come and see. Like if you come into it, you can experience it, but you have to enter to experience it. So that becomes the prerequisite, but I'll pause with that.
Okay, there's a couple of things I want to say. And one is the second session of Luke's course is called Christ is Not the Church. So that's very interesting in light of what you gentlemen are talking about. And then I thought of, again, Ivan Illich, who is one of my favorite Christian thinkers, saying that the church is, when the church is a she, not an it, then it's performing its correct function, but it becomes an it, right? So the other thing I just wanted to be personal for a second because I was thinking of my own story and how as a troubled young man, I kind of came against Christ, in a visionary sort of a way, and I rejected that. And then over time, I've developed more, let's say, love of Christian, scripture and teachings. And even though I've already made my commitment to another religion, it's interesting how let's say the truth that the Christ is bringing to the world is a slow percolating thing, 2,000 years. And maybe if we're going to Luke's way of looking at it, it's way older than that. Older than, even Christ, the Nazarene man, the Rabbi Jeshua, or whoever he was, the person who existed in that historical moment. There's something older than that, perhaps. So anyway, those are a few thoughts that I had as I was listening to you, gentlemen.
Well, Christ is not the church, and I had a similar maybe story to you, Andrew. I grew up as a Christian, and I found myself as a young man seeing all the hypocrisy of the church. And so I rejected Christianity, but it was more the institutionalization of it, not Christ. But it took me a long time to realize I wasn't rejecting Christ. I was rejecting everything that had been built around it. Not saying it was bad, but going to Jordan's point, it will inevitably fail. And so there's this real question for me, what's able to reconcile that tension between Christ and the church? And really there's a question, what was able to reconcile that tension in me between Christ and me, which is in a sense a small church, a very failed man with all sorts of faults and shortcomings, and leaning towards kind of Gurdjieff here. In a sense, the only force that can really reconcile that at a very deep level is the force of remorse. Is when I see I'm not where I should be, how far away I am from the example of Christ, how far away I am from being the man that I wish to be, or the husband, or the brother, or whatever. And so in a sense, where often the churches have failed is they put themselves above Christ rather than under him. And they don't come to that sense of needing to feel that deep remorse that we have strayed in some way, shape or form. How do we constantly keep returning back to the way, the truth and the life? No institution, no person has that. And so that's very interesting for me because there's this fractal effect in a sense that the macrocosm and the microcosm kind of relate here. How does Christ and the church, how do Christ and I begin to reconcile? Because if his presence is always here, the Alpha and the Omega, if he has always been and always will be, then there is something that is constantly pressing up against me, a knock at the door that's always needing some attention. And I don't see it as being one of trying to affirm or resist, but being able to reconcile. And that's very, very difficult. So there's something in here, and I see it almost in the Christian world at the moment, this kind of a competition to be right. Who's on the right path? Who has the right church? Who has the, we are right, which spells out war. But if I feel as though if every Christian could come and willingly move towards that remorse, which requires a seeing of how far away I am and not how close I think I am to Christ, then maybe that might be the necessary fuel, if you'd like, the necessary oil, the lubricant that might help to all Christians and non-Christians, let's just say everyone, to begin to relate in a different way. We're all small. We're all tiny. We're all very, very kind of temporary on this planet. And so this is this inversion. This is this turning the world upside down. We're not fighting for Christ, in a sense. We're wishing Christ to be here on earth with us so he can help us. For we cannot help ourselves. And that's humbling, because that is filled with the death pangs of egoism. I need to let go. I need to lose my life in order to gain it. It sounds easy in words, but after 52 years, man, it is fucking hard.
Nice. So now that we're properly lubricated, let's. I feel like there's like two really fun rotations. One, let me just I want to put an image up there. If it's fucking hard, I don't have the appropriate accent to make that language land. So, you get the image of when I was a kid, and I was wounded in some fashion. I fell off my skateboard and I had tore up my leg. There were two things that were going to happen that I really didn't want to participate in, but nonetheless were going to happen. One was some kind of extremely painful cleansing was going to happen of the wound, whatever it happened to be, hydrogen peroxide, I think, in my experience most often. And then second, the wound was going to be bandaged, which meant that at some point in the future, the bandage is going to have to come off. And for the most part, everybody's had that experience. And just, be a 5-year-old and have to be present to the searing pain of the alcohol sometimes poured on your wound, or the momentary unpleasantness of having the Band-Aid ripped off. And now here's the thing. And then just map that to everything. Because as you say, this movement of humility is like having your entire identity ripped off, and being poured with a cleansing agent, the salvation, the salve that will definitely hurt in the process of it cleaning. So that's one image. And then the second image is, Andrew, you mentioned something like, you've already chosen to follow or participate in another religion. But I remember being very taken early in my journey here by reading a book, For the Love of the World, or For the Life of the World, For the Life of the World, by a Russian Orthodox theologian, Shmeman, where he points out that Christianity isn't properly a religion. And in fact, it's precisely to the degree to which Christians take Christianity as a religion that they immediately set against each other in fighting about who knows more about the true religion that they each are holding. And this is a very weird thing to say, but you can actually work backwards and say, look, we're present to reality. And we might say that it is best for us to be truly present and fully present to reality, to be able to engage with what is real on the basis of what is real, and delude ourselves not at all, and in fact become increasingly intimate with what is real. And that's exactly the same thing. It's, Christ is saying that, do that. Now, of course, he says, I am the way, because when we speak about Christ, we have this paradox again. On the one hand, we have an image of an actual person, a biological Homo sapiens sapiens born of woman. And this is true. But on the other hand, we also have the Logos. John does that. The Word was made flesh. And the Logos is useful for us to meditate on. Because the notion of the Logos in the West, which maps, by the way, the word would also mean the Tao in the East, is the principle by which all of these kinds of things, like the ability for me to be in relationship with the world, the fact that's possible at all, the name we give to that possibility is the Logos. So if you work in the direction of just simply committing yourself to a fully intimate, fully present relationship with reality, you will discover at a certain point that you are by necessity doing so by means of primary relationship with the Logos. And then when you discover that the Logos is not an it, but a he, as we talked about, the church is not an it, but a she, then you're finding yourself face to face with the revelation of Christ. So this is a very tough thing. You know, if you put Christianity on a bookshelf next to, you know, you do the perennial thing, which is to say, by the way, you are in fact actually a modernist. You're operating in modernity. And you say, okay, I've got a bunch of different ideologies that are in books, and people might choose to follow their ideologies as a way of sort of running the operating system of how they choose to behave and how they boot up their moral structures and how they create their table of values and how they, you know, interact with each other. And I can kind of pick them off, and they're all sort of like different ones, most of which have developed over time historically in cultures. And you say, yeah, and one of them happened to develop in this synthetic movement from Jerusalem out to Athens and then through the Roman Empire in a historical moment. It'll look like it's another religion, but the proposition is that every single piece of that conversation is already happening inside a context known as reality. And Christ is the way that you can enter into relationship with reality, a very different kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. And I would say that church religion is provisional. It's not the ultimate truth. All of it is provisional. You know, even the words are provisional. Like they point to the truth, but they're still the logos. Like my original objection to Christianity was it was a bunch of people telling me stuff. And my original attraction to Buddhism was I can sit quietly and listen to the Holy Spirit on a meditation cushion, right? So I there was nobody shouting at me and telling me what was true, right? So that was very, 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 very attractive. And I don't think that's the essence of Christianity or Buddhism or anything else. Anybody's proposition about what reality is, you know, is anything ultimate. But that's not quite, I don't think that's quite postmodernism either, because I think there is a Holy Spirit, there is divine nature, there is love, etc. So, yeah.
It's definitely not postmodernism. Yeah.
No, I think well put. And I think it was Keller who, you know, when he talks about John and in the beginning was the word, and word is logos, and logos is meaning of life, quote unquote. And then what's interesting is logos is a person. So the very means of intelligibility with reality must be personal, it must be relational, it must be lived. You cannot understand reality from some sort of abstract principle. It has to be personal. And thus you get into things where personal knowledge is most fundamental. But then, of course, the question is, what is a person? You know, what exactly is the person? And to be like Christ is to somehow participate and inhabit in that question. Which, again, is funny because it makes me think of, I think it was Walker Percy who said something like a novel is a metaphor that can be put no other way. You have to get all 500 pages to get it, you know, in order to get that way of that grasp on reality. Something similar applies to the logos then. Like the only way to get the logos is to get the whole person of Christ, right? They're a novel that can be said no other way, right? The answer unfortunately is not 42. If you go to Panera and say 42, it will not open up some sort of door in the fabric of reality. So there's some sort of participatory knowledge. And of course, you know, there's a bit of a reclaiming of some of the philosophers, a beloved Michel Planier on personal knowledge. You know, there's a coming back of thinkers who were left behind, in my opinion, who very much stressed you cannot get autonomously rational or autonomously abstract understanding. There's always a personal element. I think of Feyerabend and Against Method arguing that a scientific advancement is not an abstract consensus, but some crazy guy named Galileo who's frickin' sure he's right, and he has a passionate love, and he's going to convert everyone. And it's not just the church against Galileo. The scientists are as well. Like everyone is, dang it. But there's this some sort of fire that actually, this personal element that cannot be removed. And I think that's extremely important. And so the church question, I go back to this a lot because this one's tricky, right? Because there's this one idea where you say, well, church is corrupt, we don't need it. Yeah, Apparently Christ cares about it. Apparently you're supposed to be in community, and you need to. And the other thing that also happens, if you start saying, well, we don't need church because it's fundamentally corrupt, versus it will necessarily fail and we need to be there when it fails, because that's a different relation. When you say, well, church always fails, therefore I won't go, versus church always fails and I'm still going. If we don't do that, I think the world ends up, what we're seeing is what I like to call global hikikomorism, this spread of these people that don't leave the apartment in Japan. And it has many forms of it. It could be the incel, the hikikomori, and different people, because you're always about to go see your neighbor. You're always about to go hang out in the community. And but Netflix is on. You just don't quite get there, right? Because people are unpredictable. And what if they say something that makes you question all your life decisions? So, there's something incredibly rational about hikikomorism, actually, especially when you can get your food and you can get your entertainment. And basically, a world that lacks personal knowledge rationally ends up in something like hikikomorism. And I think we increasingly see that more and more. And then the money doesn't go toward the communal services, et cetera, so forth. So it's very important to stress non-rationally, a going out, a being in the community. Now, here's the question. This is what we wrestled with at Eunoia. So Eunoia, that was a church. We called ourselves, Eunoia is loosely translated into beautiful thinking. We had, so it was a church, but we also had on Thursday art galleries, venues. We had an open mic and, all of these different things. And one of the things we kind of talked about is not looking like a church. Because the reason why you don't want to, like, aesthetically, like when you see the building, and the reason for that is because what ends up happening a lot of the times is somebody looks over, sees a giant cross on the window, and then they say, oh, that's not for me. And therefore they don't come in because I'm not Christian, right? And also it can actually protect the people inside from encountering the atheist and finding out that all your preconceived ideas about the atheist being an immoral, bad person, actually they're kind of nice. Oh, well, what do I do with that, right? How do I tarry with that reality, right? Well, if you kind of set it up aesthetically, to where you never actually have the other encounter you, all your preconceived ideas of us versus them or whatever don't get trampled, which I actually think is very important to trample them to actually get at the higher, if you grant me this, higher revelation that Christ is pointing to, that one would have to get into. But I think there's something more than us versus them dynamics that are at play, right? But if you never actually readily encounter otherness, especially as a community, you're never kind of motivated to actually go to those next levels, to go beyond, say, to be a theology geek for a moment, the Roman road that Harold Bloom talks about for something more like the King Victus, kingdom-based salvation that you see in kind of new Paulian theology, right? Well, you never have reason to go beyond that, actually, right? So some of the things you try to do, because this actually, to me, gets into structural questions of how the church is done. How do you fail well? How do you die well, as Goodell would put it, right, in the church? How do you go to this place where you fail well, right? Where you have a regular meeting place, because also it's an incredibly powerful thing when you have people who just bring the chili. We just had a meal every Thursday night and people just made it happen, right? And then, we went and fixed floors in Katrina and there were churches all over the world. I mean, that's a crazy thing, right? So you don't want to give up that. But you also don't want to do church in a manner, because this is what I'm getting at. You also don't want to do church in a manner that just becomes people who think like me, people who kind of don't actually make me uncomfortable, and actually there's a certain kind of wall that's created to keep the world out. But here's the problem. I don't think anyone necessarily intends to do that. It's not like you wake up one day and say, you know what, we want to make sure we don't want to interact with otherness. What ends up happening is that habits form, structure is made to where you don't regularly encounter otherness, right? Mm-hmm. And so what we tried to do is, we tried to base it on the arts and made people feel like, yes, you can come sing songs that are not explicitly Christian. There will be explicitly Christian songs, but really we're seeking, so this is the issue. Really we're seeking excellence that points toward beauty. I think the church really gets in trouble without the concept of beauty, because then what you're stuck in is either the good or the true. And when you're stuck in those, aren't these people immoral and don't they have a lie? So there's no benefit to relating with them. But if there is something about otherness and learning to tarry with negativity and actually be in the presence of the other who doesn't think like you, that actually will then force you to actually learn how to be Christ-likeness versus just fight them with the sword and get rid of them. If that is a unique condition of possibility to bring forth something like beauty, of which attracts people into transformation versus guilt them into change, well, then it is very difficult, I think, to deal or think of a church that is not going to more on the side end up in institutional problems than not. Now, of course, that all has to be expanded on. But I think about this a lot. I definitely, as a Christian, wrestle with the challenge of, okay, Christ isn't the church, but let's not throw out the church. But shouldn't we? Because all they ever do is mess up. No, that's not what he says. But how do we do it so we don't end up in us versus them dynamics? I think it's a real problem, but I think it's definitely something we have to think.
So, yeah, I agree, actually, rather completely. What I was seeing was maybe three different echoes of that. One echo is if you withdraw from the church because the church will fail and is corrupt, you also withdraw from the world. This is the whole, let me hunker down, sin no more on my own little, 2 by 2 foot square, and wait for the end to come, because that's sort of the only thing that's worth doing in this life. Of course, that's also not what he says. So, but then I can make that more personal, which is, this is also true of being a father, for example. Like, you will definitely fail. You will definitely fail. And the worst part about it is that, and it will hurt. Right? In fact, it will hurt maximally, because the more deeply you invest yourself in loving another, and this other happens to be your child, but they are very specifically, precisely another, the more profoundly it will hurt. Right? That's just how it works. And so the same thing with the church, right? So you get this switch. If you choose not to invest in something with that level of vulnerability, that guarantees that its failure will hurt, then you will find yourself withdrawing. And that move is exactly the wrong move. Right? So then you have to force yourself to say, okay, this is sort of the mirror of the other side, suffering. That's meaningful suffering. The meaningful suffering is to enter into these relationships of profound meaning, which, of course, as you say, the logos, right? The person of meaning, profound meaning, which then will fail, because we are finite creatures in a finite and sinful world, and that will hurt. And that is part of the lesson. That's part of the discipleship, is entering into that on a continuing basis. I think I had one more image, but trying to get that last part out made it too ripply. So maybe it'll come back. I want to punt something up in the air that I thought that Luke would be able to slam dunk, but oh well, too late. Maybe it'll come back.
Well, I was thinking maybe when Daniel was speaking about, just the intense loneliness of the present moment without communal living at all, isn't it kind of obvious why people are going back to church? Like, why, there's been this sort of question in the media, why are people doing it? Like, but isn't that what people long for, is communion? And the other thought I had was, when I was walking on the beach in Brittany and I was looking at how beautiful the culture was when such things like churches existed, how much beauty there was just in the streets and in buildings. And it's like, oh my God. And that was a time when everybody was going, to some church or other. And that was probably just an ordinary thing in their life, right? So modernity has ripped that right out of people. And
by the way, in every direction, modern architecture is ugly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so no wonder that this is happening. And that just struck me really hard when you were saying that, Daniel. And the question of beauty also, like, how else do you create actual beauty except communally and in relationship with others who are very different than you, and all ages and types and dispositions?
I find it's a fascinating question, the structure that's needed to help support one's journey. I've found in my own experience, what I wanted was the experience. I didn't necessarily care about the structure. I wanted to follow whatever worked, and whatever worked for me is, what is this quality of experience? I may not know what that is. It might be completely unknown to me. But really what brought me to Christ in the end wasn't words, wasn't the Bible, it wasn't any abstraction. It was experiencing a living presence, a quality that helped to point me inwardly to more of a wholeness. Of course, words just fail around all of this, right? So, but that was the inner compass. For me, it was really a two-way street. I did all sorts of crazy things when I was young, and that always led to the same old, same old. But when something is really experienced in the body, you know, from balls to bones, and no one can take that away from you. It's not an illusion. Something that's very real because it feels more substantial than anything else you've ever experienced. It's that can help move the dial. And so, in a sense, that's what I was looking for. But I also saw there's a trap in that, is that you always go on the hunt for the next big thing, right?
Yeah.
All the highs, you know, lots of drugs, all that sort of type of stuff. So there was a real question mark for me. Okay, you know, what's needed here? But what was interesting for me is that I needed the experience first in order to understand what I may need. You can't do it the other way around. And so I think that's, you know, part of the magnum opus, part of this great work. How do you bring people to an experience first so they could understand further down the track maybe what brought that about, what had changed in them, what was the support structure, and it might be beauty, it might be the singing of some great hymn or a song that is able to touch you, or walking in nature, or whatever that it might be. But there's this taste of this quality. And it's still a question for me. And in a sense, my work trying to move through this kind of digital medium and all the networks sort of through the Gurdjieff work and through the Christian faith is there's this constant question, what's needed for the future? What type of supports might support people in this modern world come to that experience, that once they've tasted enough of it, they can stand on their own 2 feet and smell their way to that next thing. And which for me is always with others. You can't kind of do it on your own. I know at one point in my own life it was, oh no, I'll storm the gates of heaven. I can do this. Don't you worry about that. And then, you know, God has a good laugh at you and throws you on the ground and goes, yeah, don't think so, buddy. This really brings this question: what type of relationships are then needed for that? Which is for me not a structure. For me, it's something entirely different. And I think that in that sense, this is the real question for, I'll just call it church, but really the ecclesia, the gathering of those who feel this quality. How can they begin to relate to each other in a different way? And maybe what's needed then just comes naturally.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Well, I was reading Gurdjieff speaking about different types of Christians, right? You know, he says there's like 5 types of Christians or something, and the early Christians are not so distinguishable from pagans, and then there's a very heart element of Christianity, which is just devotional and it's simple. And then there's the Protestant, which tends to be sort of revolutionary or something, or, you know, all about, you know, dialectics. And then he said the next level of Christianity is something else that perhaps that people haven't come to yet, which is kind of strange, or that hasn't been yet created. So that leads me to my question about the esoteric nature, of Gurdjieff's work, who was a Christian but didn't ever wear it on his sleeve, and often hid that from everybody, and very, he took a lot of attention to cover up the dangers of whatever he was trying to teach, the dangers of that being corrupted. And so there's the esoteric, and then there's the sort of the religion for everybody. I somehow feel there needs to be both, but yeah. Any thoughts about that?
Well, maybe just to add, yes, he had a very odd view. He says that at one time in history, the only people on earth were those who were striving to be Christians, irrespective of your religion, which is strange. Maybe that goes back to Jordan's point, that what happened 2,000 years ago wasn't the start of a religion. It was an event that laid claim to something, that helped to unlock something, unleash, put something into the world, because the world needed to change, but God couldn't break it. And so in that sense,
Yeah.
he kind of came to this, well, there's either non-Christians, those who can't, for whatever reason, with either their mind or their body or their feelings, try to orient themselves to Christ. Then there's pre-Christians who are striving to do such but are not quite there. And then there are those fortunate few who might be called Christians, who are able to do it with their entire being. So that's an interesting notion, that Christ is not a religion.
Mm. I want to riff on that a little bit. There's a piece of it. What I'm about to say is only a piece of it, probably like at the level of xylophone. In terms of beauty, it's just a very plinky piece. But when we try to think of, I'll put it this way: when we try to think of Christ through the lens of a religion, one of the moves that we're engaging in is precisely the modernist move, and particularly making a distinction between being in the world, being in first person, and being a remove from the world, observing the world from that remove, being in third person. And of course, modernity is in some sense essentially about that third person perspective, which provisions you with a variety of different capabilities and powers over the world, but by necessity separates you from the world. And then what you do is you name things in the world. An event occurred in the world, but I, standing outside of the world and looking at it, can name that event. And by naming that event, I can now control, I can contain that event. Every event that happens in the world by necessity must happen within the view that I am taking up above the world and looking at it. And this, by the way, when I say modern, obviously I'm including all the different things that have the word modern in them. The modernity, postmodernity, metamodernity are all of the same ilk. They're variations on a theme, different flavors of ice cream. Pick your flavor. And the invitation is something like actually just being in the world again. So in this sense, if Gurdjieff is saying that those who simply lived in the world by necessity were navigating themselves by means of and towards the logos. Lacking special revelation, they were doing their best in the context that they were living in. And by the way, lacking the taking of dominion from the powers of this world, they're also having to navigate an environment where the principalities were ascendant, which is a really tough place to be. And if you spend time with actual indigenous people who actually still have a continuity of contact with a lineage that predates Christ, you'll notice how upfront and center the spiritual world is for them. And it's not a kind of a thing that sits over here in the corner with our Ouija board, or over there with our crystals and feathers. It's like everywhere all the time, mostly, primary in almost every possible interaction. And intrinsically interwoven. Right? Reality simply is. You could speak to like the animist sensibility, for example. And I guess the point is that's actually how reality is. That's a more real view of reality than the third person perspective. And we now have to find a way to step back into that first person perspective, step back into reality, but now with the benefit of Christ, with the benefit of the actual event that Luke is mentioning having occurred, and how do we make our way into that? Yeah, and just one last little kind of bell. Now I'll take it up one tone from xylophone to triangles. At least it's got some resonance, or just a bell, a nice bell. Yeah, bing. Beauty first. I don't know if we've actually had this conversation, Andrew. It may have been like we've talked about this in one of our previous conversations, but with Timothy Patitsis, maybe Father. Fred, I don't know what his title is. His book, The Ethics of Beauty. I mean, I learned this phrase, beauty first. Like of the three, one must enter into relationship with Christ, beauty first. Then truth and good can be properly situated. But if you don't do it that way, then things get very wacky very quickly. And one may say, for example, just to kind of bridge, perhaps beauty is first person. Perhaps by the very nature, beauty is about presence, about being present to, and the disclosure of presence to you is what we call beauty.
I think you said something that's much more than a xylophone there, Jordan. It strikes me as like a trumpet or something, especially the part about first person, because that seems radical, and that seems radically misunderstood. Because that includes everything, right? You mentioned the indigenous people. It kind of it brings back reality to where it should be, after it has gone so far into darkness or astray, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is again a huge reduction, but one of the big takeaways I had from my time with Buddhism was how much of it was about getting you out of that trap of being in a third person relationship with reality.
Yeah, and certainly the Gurdjieff work. Um, hmm.
Magnificent. I have a beloved friend, Thomas Jockin, who does a lot of work on beauty in Plato, and he's adamant that the good in Plato and Aristotle is actually the word for beauty. That although there is, of course, something about the good in Plato, there's been, we simply don't know what beauty is either. We think beauty is merely aesthetic symmetry or taste, when really a key is that beauty has a certain strike to it. We like to talk about the strike of beauty. The way that I like to describe this, based on, and I think this starts to get at what the church has to do to not fall, because there's a ditch on either side of the road. Like it's not institutionalized enough, but then it's not institutionalized, it's too little, you get trouble. So there's some sort of mean, if you will, that has to be navigated. And if only we could systemize it. But by definition, a mean is something that you have to do like cooking. You taste it as you go. And if it's me cooking, you never get there. But anyway, but there's this idea. So Walker Percy has this idea. Say he imagines the conquistadors are going through the forest or whatever, and they come upon the Grand Canyon, and no one knows it exists. And there is no phrase, the Grand Canyon. And they've never seen a photograph. And there it is. That's beauty. And you see, the problem is, and Walker Benjamin was getting at this as well with the loss of aura, is we now go to the Grand Canyon to confirm photographs we've seen of the Grand Canyon. Therefore, it cannot strike us. We now go to church to confirm what church is. Is this a church? Therefore, it cannot strike us, right? Beauty has a certain strike characteristic. Another example I always think about, imagine you were there live for Beethoven's Ninth, and you didn't know it was going to be Beethoven's Ninth, and there it was. And you may never, ever hear it again. You may never hear it again. And you may tell your grandchild, I'm telling you guys, there was this music, like, okay, Pops, whatever, I'm telling you. And you could never hear it again. All you had was the memory of it. That's the strike of beauty. And you see, the problem is that in our age of listening to MP3s or photographs or the technological essence that Heidegger warns about, it is very, very difficult to not have a confirmation theory of truth, if you will, to confirm this is the Grand Canyon, as opposed to let us strike us, which fundamentally the strike of beauty is personal, it is individual, and can only be experienced. And here's the key. There are certain conditions. So there's this idea, I like to talk, because they're talking about church as not an institution, but a certain experience, Luke, a certain energy, you could even say Holy Spirit, right? I like to talk about conditionalism. And what I have in mind with that is I'll just use Owen Barfield's famous example, right? So a rainbow. Does a rainbow exist? Of course it exists. Is it an illusion? No, but it requires certain conditions to be there. And by the way, it's not merely you, because other people who are there with the sun coming out and you're in this position and it's raining, anyone could see the rainbow who meet the conditions and you would experience it, right? So it's not concrete like this table or something is always there all the time. You have to meet certain conditions and then it is there, but it's also not a dream, like a hallucination, right? I think the church is at its best when it's somehow meeting a conditionality to make something like a rainbow. Which are also the conditionality. There are certain conditions required for the strike of beauty, for the Grand Canyon to hit you in this certain way. It is remarkably difficult now in the modern world to determine what conditions are needed because we are so drunk, we're so consumed in technology and systemization and protocol. We don't believe it's real unless it's repeatable. If it's not repeatable, if you can't do it every Sunday, it's not real, right? Well, you can repeat it every time you have the conditions, but the conditions are not given, right? So there is a certain concreteness to it, but it's not the same kind of concreteness as a repeatable pattern. And by definition, if it is perfectly repeatable, it's not personal, it's not human, and it's flat, therefore dead, right? So we're in an age of conditionality. Conditionalism, if you grant. I like that phrase too, because it's like going, I think part of it is virtue, as Joachim will stress. You got to go to the gym and condition yourself. There's a certain personal development required to participate in the conditions necessary to make the effect of the Gurdjieffian energy, the rainbow, and the Holy Spirit. So it's both spatial and individual, right? And ergo relational, right? Because it has to be in the relation between the individual and the conditions that make the rainbow, or the jazz improvisation, et cetera, so forth, right? So what would it mean to have a church that thought in terms of how do we create the conditions so that the spirits show up? I think this is a thrust of one of the reasons American Pentecostalism has done so well over the last 20 years, is there's this true freaking belief that Jesus really could show up. He really might show up, actually. Are y'all ready for that? I mean, you might be reduced to ash in 2 seconds if you're not ready. There's that real sense. Now, one of the things that has to be questioned are, what were the truths of that? Because you could argue there have been some pathologies that have developed in Pentecostalism that are not very good. I think there's some lessons to be thought in all of that together. But genuinely believing there are certain conditions that can be met by which the Spirit shows up, that's a very different kind of church than one of, we need to go because if our neighbor asks us what we did and they're Christian and we can't tell them we went to church, we're a bad person. So that's that's an entirely different invitation. But here's the issue. These conditions seem inseparable from the personal, okay? The personal knowledge. Whatever creates these conditions require the person in a very radical way. Well, what keeps us from the person? Well, various categories of understanding. You were mentioning, Jordan, modernity, categories, naming, understanding. They create a certain box by which we understand things. We always are putting people in boxes. Oh, you're an engineer. Oh, you go here. Oh, you go there. I understand you. I'm creating a structure by which to understand you to reduce surprise, the unknown, and a lack of knowledge. Which, here's the trick. All of that can seem like I'm trying to get to know you, but actually I'm not. I only get to know you when I have a radical encounter with you, right? So one of the problems, there's many things. I'll stop. One of the problems is all of our tokens of understanding how to relate to other people actually is the opposite of relating with other people. We're gaining knowledge of good and evil about other people, but we're not actually gaining the relationality of the other person because we're not actually putting our places in places to be surprised, like a Grand Canyon that we haven't said to photograph. But one of the reasons we don't do that is because we got to be able to handle it. And we're not. A lot of us are not. And because you also mentioned the private public. There's a wonderful book, John Malice. He wrote Private Faith in a Public Space. He goes through Gregory of Nicaea, Kierkegaard, and Bonhoeffer to talk about the tensions of turning Christianity into a currency. Look, I'm a Christian, elect me. Look, you know I'm a good person. So there's always this tension of how do you bring a private thing to the public without turning it into a social currency, right? Basically, to cut to the chase, it's impossible without some sort of beauty principle, which is it can only be known in doing it. If you don't have that, then you're always going to have the public-private problem. That is always going to fall apart. You have to have some kind of unknown with the UN in parentheses that can only be known in experience. But that's a wonderful book, Mausik's book. The last thing I'll say on this problem that actually I have way more sticky notes, but the last thing I'll say for now is on Hikikomorism. So here's the problem. You're exactly right. You can go, well, wait, come on, Dan. Isn't everyone like going out and joining community and aren't they excited? Well, yes. I hope the church is ready for it because here's the problem. You got all these people that show up who are open finally. They're open to community. And the church isn't able to give them that love. In fact, these people are maybe socially awkward or they have ideas you don't like. If you're not ready for that and you hurt them, then they're going to go back to their apartment and now they're going to say, I knew it. I knew I shouldn't have left. I knew it was silly. I knew I shouldn't have given it a shot. That's a very real danger. You know, C.S. Lewis said hell was locked from the inside. Yeah. It's really important to make sure that that doesn't occur. I think we see I'm going to say there are 4 movements. That's always dangerous. There's 4 things going on. There's the technology will save us all, the logical end of Ivan Illich's disablement, transhumanism, all that jazz. Then there's a return of, dare I say, the risk of small fascist states, of everyone finding people that are kind of like them, but that leads to its own pathologies. Then you have an isolationism. You kind of a radical, why can't we just be Amish thing, which is completely understandable. But then you also have, this movement of people that are just going into the Hikikomorism that is occurring, right? All of those things are on offer, and there's more that can be said about that. If beauty is not brought into the conversation, all of those are rational. There is nothing seen to show that rationality, according to its understandings of truth and goodness, is missing out on something, right? Because there are not places in society, people can regularly go to that meet the conditions of the rainbow, per se, of the Holy Spirit, to show that actually there is something of which is beyond all of those on offer. But then, of course, that would require Christians to, do the work of those things. I am now thinking, ultimately, this all comes to the giant question of the Grand Inquisitor and the Brothers Karamazov, because that, to me, is the problem between Christ and the church. But, and he was Orthodox. I'll stop.
Okay, I want to bring it back to, you just wrote a novel there, I think, Daniel. And so this is what Daniel does. He writes about like a 5,000 word essay or a novel whenever he opens his mouth. But I want to go back to Luke's course and just the idea of the offense of Christ and the fact that we're living in a world of representations of reality and we're totally lost in representations. And it seems to me that the image of Christ is so utterly offensive because it just destroys all the representations. That was the insight I got. Even of beauty, whatever it happens to be, it breaks down all of the the representations, and it presents you with this terrible paradox, right, of death, and also beauty simultaneously. So, and horror, and also the horror and the beauty all at once, without giving you a moment to actually be able to put that into a representation that will serve you in any way. It just slays you, right? So anyway, that's my insight here, and bring it back to Luke's course.
Wait, just one second. I just gotta put this in. So, let's see if I can figure out how to say this right. Okay, so we have the advantage. I'll call it an advantage. We have the advantage that what Daniel just did, ostensibly at least, was recorded, and there's an irony in that, of course. But the point is this: I, at least in the experience of that, was present 2 or 3 times to the fear of the Lord, to the fact that when one is actually witness to the Holy Spirit speaking into reality, you are actually brought face to face with the Grand Canyon for the first time. I would recommend that if you did not have that experience, relax, pray, and watch it again. You should have at least one encounter that causes you to actually have that fear and trembling. You will actually have a Jobian experience of the recognition that the most basic element of your relationship with the Logos is actually beauty, but beauty ain't good in the simple sense, right? Beauty is awe, right? Beauty has that experience of like, oh shit, right? You should have some period of a moment of actually like, whoa, and fear, like actual holy smokes, I don't know, because you have no idea what you're dealing with, right? It is absolutely unsafe. Now, of course, the good news, by the way, Christ is good, not safe at all, safe, but very, very good.
Hmm. Yeah, good not as like in any strict moral sense, just good the way reality is good, right? The way the color red is good, you know. You can't argue with that. You know, it's that kind of good. It's not good. I mean, it might be good in action. It's good in action. It's not good as
It's
proposition.
I mean, Daniel put it just right. It's not good subject to your own use of the knowledge of good and evil. Good.
Yeah,
It-
yeah, got it.
Yeah, it just what's coming up for me as people are speaking, and maybe just to kind of break something down in a very simple form. Um, in the Gurdjieff work, and you'll certainly find this with the Desert Fathers
mm,
and many other ways to practice, but this coming into the body, the temple of the spirit,
mm,
as you said, to soften, to relax, to this gift we've been given that allows us to experience all of these things. To come into contact with that, and I've certainly found over the years, is almost always a new experience. All of the way the sense of the body, which is really all of the energies and forces that move through the world, are moving through me. It's a very raw experience. And I think maybe in a way, some of those practices, and particularly with what Gurdjieff had brought, is this coming into contact again with what is real. And what is real is I breathe. I'm here. The body is alive. The vital energies are here. And that gives expression to something. It's the instrument of the spirit. Um, and in a modern culture that's very disembodied, just a simple act of being able to come back inside and have a connection with that is, in my experience, something utterly unique because it is always fresh. It is always, wow, I didn't realize that or that sensation there. And so something speaks to me in a different
mm,
way that words do, or emails, or a
mm,
phone call. And so what Daniel was talking about, this kind of beauty, which is, yeah, not good nor evil. It is what it is. The body is what it is. There's no kind of judgment with it. If I'm in pain, then I'm in pain. If there's another sensation there that I can come into contact with, which also means I can see something about myself in a concrete way that I cannot see in any other way, and nor can anyone else see it as well. So this comes back to that notion that the beauty is also in us. It's not just the outside. It's not just being awestruck with something. It is something that can be felt within. and we can make a contact with that intentionally. And these exercises and these practices all the way through all of the esoteric groups, all the brotherhoods, that there's the conditions that we can set up inside to get a sense of this beauty, but beauty through the senses, in a sense, which sometimes is seen as a bit of a bad thing. That's the passions of the flesh, but we were given it. We were given this organization, if you'd like it, this complexity of energies swirling around in a loose array of structure. And rather than reject it, we kind of need to know it from the inside. And maybe something can come in. So this notion of communion and union with God, the theosis.
I want to add, yeah,
Gurdjieff.
I want to add theosis, and I want to add the notion of the hardest way, because we've spoken about the offense of Christ. We've spoken about Christ is not the church, and your third session is about the hardest way, theosis. So I'm wondering, I was thinking about beauty and hardness. I was thinking about those two kind of seemingly opposites. Yeah, and the ultimate aim of Christianity, theosis, through divine union and the terror of transformation. I'm just using your words here from the course. Um, it seems like, you know, the Grand Canyon.
Well, for me, what I find interesting is those experiences of awe, those of the beauty of the Grand Canyon. What's needed in that moment? I need to be open to it. If my heart's closed up, if I'm coming to it with expectation, as Daniel pointed out, I see nothing. I'm closed. It ricochets off me. But if I can come to it with what's here, I come to it with I don't know, then all of a sudden something opens. And for me, the heart of the matter is the heart of the matter. In a strange way, Christ, how to open one's heart intelligently so that I can receive. And Christ's gift is always the greatest gift, but it's constantly rejected, which is always odd. So this for me is very much, how does one in a very practical sense, how do I begin to open? Not kind of blindly open, that I get kind of overwhelmed with everything and get, kind of bulldozed, but to just begin to sort of open up. And that does require practice. It does require a discipline in a strange kind of way. But it's not hard. It's not harsh. It's not an imposition. How does one come to something openly, be vulnerable in that openness, and yet not be cut down? So this is this interesting interplay, because this very much talks to this state of communion, which is in communication, in relationship. How does something enter me? How do I receive? How do I receive all of you and you receive me? Jordan was saying, if I can be soft, if I can pray, what does praying do in a very kind of rudimentary sense? I move out of the way and I try to open to something. And so we've in a modern world, we've kind of lost that.
I guess it's hard because we're hard, because we've tied knots around ourselves, in this very intense way, and we've become hard. I think the word endure in French means become hard. So,
Yeah.
I suppose the hard thing is to break that particular shell and notice that how unconsciously we are behaving and going through all of these sort of
Mm.
bizarre rituals with ourselves,
Ah,
doing things that we don't mean to do all the time, like when you could be having an affair or eating too much or what I guess you would call that in Christianity being a sinner or whatever is just not being open, right?
No, well, you're moving away from something in that sense. And that last session, the hardest way. The hardest way is hard because it's hard to be open and soft.
hmm
It's
Imagine,
it's easy
imagine,
to be hard.
imagine somebody who is not a child, so let's say 12, um, who has not yet learned how to dance in any way and is beginning to take classes in dance. And I mean very, very good ones, right? Very carefully. The movement of the hand, the poising of the body, and the undoing of different habits of gait and the way that the mind and the body get in each other's way. As this person undergoes this process, they become graceful,
Hmm.
right?
Mm.
They become full of grace. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about to receive grace, but to have that grace not just pour over us, but to actually fill us and therefore become smoother, become more capable of receiving, more capable of actually then also co-creating, right, participating, to receive and then to respond. Now, a dancer does this in the context of music, which is one of the ways that God creates and communicates. But more broadly, we're learning how to do this in relationship with all of the ways that God communicates, particularly the very bespoke way, the uniquely bespoke way that God communicates with each one of us.
Magnificent. So a few things come to mind. The fantastic Ross Bird talks about how we have to understand, a lot of what God is doing with his hiddenness as this tension between inclusion and holiness. Because if he includes you too soon, you are reduced to ash and destroyed. An image I kind of like to go through is maybe Canto 20, 19, Paradiso. So Dante is not happy. Beatrice won't smile. Why won't you smile, Beatrice? And Beatrice is like, buddy, if I were to smile right now at the level you're at, it would reduce you to ash like Simile. And this is fascinating because it suggests that Dante's not out of the woods. Ain't he in Paradiso? He came out of Inferno. There's actually still something to learn. So you could look at hell as good, learning that not falling into evil or sin and doing the good. Okay? But actually, in the Paradiso, that's not enough. There's actually a certain development that is still required, right? I like to talk about Lovecraft with the parentheses around craft, right? Like if you're dealing with beauty, because that's what Beatrice ultimately is, if you're dealing with God, you're dealing with something incredibly dangerous because if you're not ready for it, it destroys you. So literally in Christianity or in holiness, there is still actually a developmental or work that needs to be done actually so that you are not destroyed by holiness. You're not destroyed by God, that you're not reduced to ash. And that becomes the challenge of the Christian, you could say, right? Is actually how do you come to handle more of Beatrice's smile? How do you come to handle a reality where it's the Grand Canyon without knowing what it is? I mean, wouldn't that fry your brain if everything you experience was without a category to understand it? I mean, that's a high demand, right? Well,
Yeah.
that is what's being suggested in Dante, that you're actually supposed to get in the obviously at the end where the wings fail the lofty fantasy, there's a suggestion that this can go on forever, and actually this is what you were made for and enjoy, and that's where you find enjoyment, is this ever development of a capacity to get the fullness of things. I think it's at the end of Narnia where Lewis is like, yeah, New Jerusalem is where blue is more like blue, where people are more like people. It's not escaping blueness, it's not going out of the world, it's gaining the Cezannean capacities to actually meet the conditions of the full access of reality and thus shine with it yourself. And that is a lot of this kind of another reason the church, in my opinion, has become painful for many people is because it's in a logic of Inferno and it hasn't moved to the logic of Paradiso. It's helping us not sin, great, but it's not helping us handle more of Beatrice's smile. Okay, and that's a problem. To me, Gurdjieff with practices, energy, all the stuff you're talking about is actually in the realm. Like a Christian may hear that and say, Well, what's that going to do? It's about handling more of Beatrice's smile. It's about handing more of the Grand Canyon without the pictures. It's about, because here's the other thing, like a way to think about the Torah to the gospel. And somebody said this, maybe I can't remember who, but it's this idea that in the Torah, you could say God is making a people, okay? And they're kind of in a way beautiful because the queen comes in of Sheba, like people are attracted, right? They come in, right? So there's this kind of making of a people that shine, evangelism by shine. Shine, attract in, because the evangelism of beauty is shine, not verbal, okay? Now, in the gospel, you can say God sends people out. But there is the assumption that people are still going to be shining and beautiful when they go out, though. It's not that, those are separate things. It's that when you go out, there's still the shine. But here's the issue. The greater if you grant me this, the greater the diversity, pluralism, complexity, distance you go in, the more difficult it is to keep shining, because the more it is you fall into habits you don't mean to, the more you encounter the other that's not intelligible and you don't know how to meet them. So shining becomes really, really difficult. A way I look at Paul, whether it's right or wrong, is in a kind of way, and I wouldn't, I kind of sometimes think about Paul as the Third Testament. And what I mean by that is he's trying to, he is live situationally reasoning what it would mean like for the Christian to go into, say, Corinth or whatever, be true to the gospel, but also not stupid. Like an example I will make, 1 Corinthians, where he's talking about the food. He's like, okay, everyone, all right, if the pagans are around, don't eat that food on the altar because they'll think you're worshiping that God, right? But if they're not around, of course you can eat the food because those powers don't have any power over you, right? So what is this? What is this? This is situationally reasoning. Because if he says the food is fundamentally evil and you can never drink it, well, that's reifying a certain ontology, a certain being that would be very problematic. But then if you just say, well, just carelessly go up and eat there, well, the pagans won't understand it, right? So what is he trying to do? He's situationally reasoning in live situations to figure out the way that the Christian can continue to shine with the gospel and not be unintelligible, right? I actually think we can look at Paul in this sense as a kind of model. I mean, N.T. Wright basically says he invents theology, if you grant that or not. Theology as this kind of creation of situationally reasoning on live metaphysical principles. Because, like, for example, Jesus doesn't tell us what to do with drones, right? He doesn't tell us what to do with drones, but that doesn't mean we can't think about drones in light of Jesus, just using the means of intelligibility and situational reasoning that Paul is putting forth, right? But what is Paul doing? He's talking about sharing the gospel, of course, but also in here there's a notion of shining with the gospel and actually being intelligible in that shine. And simply what I mean by saying Paul sometimes I think of as a Third Testament is because otherwise we can just say, is Paul repeating what Jesus was saying, or it's just kind of, there's kind of this, well, Paul is for adults and the gospel is for kids, but really the real theology is in Paul or whatever. No, Paul is absolutely complementing situationally reasoning in light of the life of Jesus, what to do in live situations, right? And you need to see those things going together or you get into lots of trouble. Now, I'd have to put meat on those bones, but I don't have any meat right now, so forgive me. But there really is this idea of holiness and inclusion, as Bird puts it, that's very well, and I really suggest his work. That's very important. Now, the tension, I think, that you get is that nobody means to stop shining, right? Nobody means, they don't wake up one day and say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stop shining, right? What ends up happening is you get into habits. And, James K.A. Smith has this lovely book called You Are What You Love. And the idea is that what you love forms your habit. So if you go to the mall and you enjoy it, it's a kind of liturgy, as he describes, it forms a habit. And character is habits, kind of in a virtue ethics sort of thing, and so on and so forth, right? So what ends up happening is we end up loving things that we don't realize we're loving, maybe. We then form habits that we don't mean to form. And we actually then get into a place where we stop shining or participating in this beauty that we are describing and not realizing we're doing it, right? That, to me, when I was speaking with Yonoya having space for otherness, one of the reasons why the church has to have some mechanism of always encountering otherness is because if you cease encountering otherness, then the probability of you falling into habits that cut you off from the world or shining and gets you into intelligible categorizations skyrockets, right? So you need that loving of the neighbor. Who is your enemy? Like, this is nuts. Because if anyone is going to wake you up out of your preset ideas of how the world works, it's your enemy, because they think you're wrong. So the surprise, the encounter, it shatters your categories, right? So you need regular encounter with the enemy in order to have that occur. If the church doesn't have mechanisms by which to genuinely encounter the other or the neighbor or the enemy, it's only a matter of time before it ends up in habits that it doesn't even know it's fallen into, that keeps it into categories of intelligibility that cuts it off from reality in the name of saving it. And that becomes a very dire matter. So you have to have a means of otherness. The last thing I'll say, okay, but you see, one of the reasons the church doesn't do this, and I think about this all the time with Jesus, like Jesus is a Jew. So, and Jesus obviously loves the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It's not like he hates them or anything. Now, he has some stern freaking words, but, it's not like he hates them, right? But what does Jesus constantly do? He constantly appears a heretic. Like, he looks like, he's not washing the hands, his disciples, he's sitting with sinners, so he appears a heretic. I didn't say is a heretic. I said appears a heretic, because he's actually a fulfillment, but they can't make that intelligible. So he has to appear heretical. That, to me, is part of the secret, dare I say secret, it's in the open, but that's part of the key to this tension of the church not falling into an auto-cannibalistic system that devours everyone, is the church has to always actually be willing to have the courage to appear heretical in, say, interacting with non-Christians or being with non-Christians or doing things that don't fit into the obvious categories of being Christian. Because when you stop appearing heretical, then that means you've made an idol of the categories of intelligibility that thus cuts you off from, I suppose you could say, the icon or the higher horizon, right? Because you have a confirmation theory of truth. You want to confirm that you're a good church. You want to confirm that you're doing what a Christian is. Well, you're cut off from the openness then, right? So there has to be mechanisms of, like, if you have an open mic where people could sing non-explicitly Christian songs, well, you're ashamed of the gospel. You're not spreading the word. You're being a bad Christian, right? Well, those are the things you have to do. Jesus is willing to appear heretical in order to show the way to fulfillment. If we're not willing to, quote unquote, appear heretical because we don't want to be seen as leaving the faith or doing something Jesus wouldn't approve of, there's some wisdom to that concern, because you could take this, but this is where you need beauty, or you need the costly grace versus cheap grace that Bonhoeffer's talking about. Like, you need that entire package to understand that appearing heretical does not mean Paul Tillich, unfortunately, red light district, doing whatever you want because of ultimate concern transcends you from the particularity of your lived experience. Paul Tillich says.
Well, Gurdjieff was extremely is considered a heretic, isn't he? And
yes,
Luke has convinced me that he's a Christian, so that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, there has to be.
I think he was imitating Christ in that way that you're speaking of, perhaps.
Well, the trick to it, I'll stop, is that the appearing heretical has to come from an honest fidelity and genuine commitment to the faith, yes, to the person of Christ. You can't choose your appearing heretical. That's like choosing your rejection, right? I'm gonna do that. It has to be from, we're gonna go into beauty. There are a whole lot of American churches, I'll just say, that when you start talking about beauty, they're like, what are you talking about? That's not serving the gospel. If you talk about excellence in the arts, they'll think that's a waste of time, and you're prideful, you're actually looking for your own embetterment. That's one of the reasons the church gets stuck, because the things that break you out of these set frameworks of intelligibility that actually lock the church out, they look like a good idea to the church to be locked in them. Right? That's what nobody intends for the church to be shut down or for the Christian not to envelop, because the things that hold us back seem like a good idea. It's a good idea not to stay in this box. And that's when the death occurs, because then basically you're operating according to the knowledge of good and evil, not the relationship of God, which is one of beauty. The moment you start, the church fails, because I go back to that. The church fails because it seems to inevitably fall to the temptation of the knowledge of good and evil, of understanding itself, having self-understanding versus Peter Peter couldn't help but look down. couldn't help but look at himself instead of looking at Jesus, right? The moment you look at yourself into intelligibility or in the knowledge of good and evil and auto-cannibalism, you self-efface. And so you can't do that. But then you have the pressure of other people. You want to justify, how do we make money? And all of those things occur. But that has to be resisted. One of the things that does give me hope, you mentioned, Jordan, on this idea of this being recorded. I do think we've had an oral tradition when people were speaking. Then you had the written tradition, which William Ong notes kind of creates an inner capacity. I know Dr. Anton spoke with that about Guy Senstock. And today we almost have kind of a Zoom tradition, which I think see a lot of hope in, because you can actually now forget you're being recorded. And actually you're talking about theosis, you're talking about the conversation, that's sort of life. Like, it enables the ability to actually record that and maintain self-forgetfulness to show that it's a possibility. And if it's a possibility, then it could be something we do as well, right? And I also think in the same way that William Ong talks about the written word, change it, like it gave us the ability of the scientific treatise. We could then think more creatively. We got a more flexible mind, right? But it came with the risk of an inner space we could withdraw into. That's the problem. The written tradition gave us an inner space that you could draw into, right? And we're at the age where we're all falling, the society is doing that. Well, now you have, dare I say, a kind of Zoom tradition, I don't know if I called it, but it's a sort of like bringing those things together now. What would it look like for the church to really own that? Especially if subjectivity is structured by language use. Like if
second orality, isn't that Ong's term, second orality? Like
I believe so.
In a stage of second or anyway, yeah.
Oh, no, I mean, he's a big deal. And really owning that and thinking about how information technology structure subjectivity. And actually then, if all of this is tied to a greater personal knowledge, what would it mean for the church to really, really own that? I'll pause there.
So are we still on topic in terms of why the world hates Christianity? Are we? I think we are, for sure, but maybe we want to just tie it in more explicitly.
Because we're not doing that.
Well, no, I think these are all quite valuable points, and maybe I circle back to something Jordan said in terms of framing this. There is why the world hates Christianity, and then there's why the world hates Christianity. And there's so much to it, everything that we've kind of talked about, how the church can cut itself off. Christ is not the church, but Christ needs the church. In a sense, we need the church also, the communal support that we all need, because no one can come to Christ alone. Yet at the end of the day, no one can work for you. No one can pray for you. In that sense, you need to find your own way and your own relationship back to it. So there's all these incredibly difficult asks that are made by Christ. It's not an easy road. And right from the get-go, it does turn everything upside down. It does challenge the very image we have of ourselves in the world, that the divine entered human so the human could find its way back to the divine. That kind of puts us in our place, and that's something that the modern mind, with all of the paraphernalia around it, finds it increasingly hard to accept as we build our Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
We're almost there. Come on, just stay with it for just a little bit longer and we'll be there. I think it's on Mars.
Yeah, it's
White line fever,
Of
Mars.
course it's on Mars. Why else would, we must be building all these things? Of course. Yeah. Yeah. So, gentlemen, any concluding concluding remarks? I've been rendered speechless by the intense ideation and implications of all these things. It was
that was great. I really, really enjoyed that. Thank you very much, guys. I like the fact that everybody here is very different. Like there's a lot of different energies, but it all kind of, at least for me, there's a lot like that's the kind of thing that I would imagine a lot of folks are going to appreciate. And yeah, and I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it's always kind of hard to end because there is no end to these conversations. So it feels difficult to end it and when to end it and so all I can say is yeah, heartfelt thanks for this conversation and I'm looking forward to getting out into the world and I'm looking forward to Luke's course. Luke's courses have always been really great. And so please come and join us.
Can I make a quick shout out to that kid who's watching this in the year 38, 37? Very, very, very downstream of the inception of the church tradition of Zoom culture's secondary orality.
This is where I began, folks.
What up? What up?
Then
The OG.
This is the Genesis. All right.
yeah.
Thank you very much again. Bye-bye.